Tisztelt elnök úr, tisztelt hölgyeim és uraim, kedves hallgatóim! Körülbelül 20 percben nehéz elmesélni, elmondani, akár csak a legfontosabb összefüggéseit.
In about 20 minutes, it's pretty difficult to share with you about the most important correlation of the history of Eastern Europe, the Irish apple. But let me make an effort here. Peace is always the best. And I have another starting statement. There's no situation which couldn't be resolved in normal peace. Transylvania is too big of a bite for everyone. And my third statement is that we can understand the current situation is if we look at the historiography of this current situation in hindsight, and I make an effort to that. First and foremost, I will examine that in before 1918, when, you know, the 1866 is the year of the compromise, so in the age of dualism, and also way before that, the Romanians, what kind of historical position they were in. We Hungarians, in the spring of 2020, we are in the form of diaspora. There are Hungarians living in 8, 9 or 10 different countries as a result of the Trianon dictate. Well, the Romanians before 1918 were in the same situation. Let's just take a stock of it. Where were Romanians living? There was Moldova or Wallachia, which was a kind of principality, and at the end of 1859 there was a Ion Alexandra Cuza, who was a colonel, liberal, who was a Romanian politician, who was elected to be the prince of both principality in Vajdaság, and he was a prince until 1866, so he merged these two areas. This is Moldova and Wallachia. These are already two areas. Most of the Romanians outside Romania were living in Transylvania. In 1910, which was the last integral royal census, there were 2.9 million Romanians living in Transylvania. There were some more Romanians living in Bessarabia, which belonged to the Russian Empire, and it had no other ways of having any ethnical or religious rights. There were also Romanians living next in Dobroja, which area did not belong to Romania, never. This was owned by the Turkish Sultanate. On July 13th, 1878, which was on the final day of the Berlin Conference, Count Andrássy, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, he proposed that this seaside should be given to the Romanian Principality, because at that time, since 1866, there was a Hohenzollern Sigmaringen Karl, who was the Prince of Romania, and the Germans thought it would be a good idea, and also Count Andrássy, to enlarge Romania. But this was the fifth or the fourth or the fifth area. Let me just mention to you two more territories where Romanians are living without any rights whatsoever. And so it's North Greece, and also in the northeastern part of Serbia. Already at that time there was a discord between Serbia and Romania. But what does that mean? Well, that in all the territories where the Romanians were living, the least in the monarchy, the Romanians were oppressed, which was quite a logical consequence, therefore, that since the 1840s, Romanian intellectuals, mostly in Transylvania, but also in Bucharest, they started to consider that this diaspora is not good for them. And they realized, absolutely logically, just as we Hungarians are thinking of it, that this diaspora should be brought to the end. And here comes my next idea, that the Romanian national identity developed in the time of the diaspora, which again triggered a lot of psychopathological thoughts in the Romanians, because all the other neighboring countries, the Russians, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, and the Serbians, maybe not the Greeks, are the elements of the enemy of the Romanians, as they think. But now in 2020, we are the Hungarians are the ones who are considered to be enemies, because we are the most the biggest number in this territory. So Carol became the first king of Romania, and he got his crown, which was cast from an iron cannon that was made in 1857. But the Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen dynasty approved it and accepted it very much. And as after Romania became a kingdom, this became into a very, very specific situation. Well, the Romania, since the 1880 to 1883, what kind of position it got? Well, this was enclosed in between three major powers. Romania, which was altogether 130 square kilometers, was enclosed between the brutally strong Tsar of Russia, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and the Turkish Empire. You know, Russia, with 21 million square kilometers, has always been the biggest country of Europe. The second largest empire, 670,000, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, but the Turks were there as well, but they got weaker already. And the Romanian government in around 1882, 1883, because the Italian kingdom also joins the German-Hungarian monarchy, and the Romanian kingdom in 1883 would make a military agreement with the Austro-Hungarian, which again will play an important role later, because we will be betrayed in 1916. So the Romanian national identity understood it very well, that this kind of division must be stopped. How should I tell it? Because I'm just being pressed by time. Well, first and foremost, out of the Romanian intellectuals, it was the artists and teachers, not the politicians, because they were quite careful. But artists and teachers, you know, the Romanian schooling and education system, Spiru Haret, who was the Romanian József Ötvös, they organized such an educational system in which, when they were teaching history and literature, the most important power of the Romanian history is appearing. It's a Daco-Romanian continuity. If you double-check it in Google, you can't find anything about that, but the Romanian irredentic movements, which were focused on Transylvania, it is the Patinu Conservator and Patinu Liberator, and their politicians before the First World War, they didn't say that we are irredentic, but that we would like to restore the Daco-Romanian monarchy. And in the educational system, this is what happened. And systematically, this strengthened the picture of the Hungarians. And let me just quote a very famous Romanian poet who wrote a poem about that, who said that they will unite not only the historical Transylvania from Királyhágó to the Sebes Castle, but up to the river Tisza. So this Jewish boy who was born in 1850 and who went to a Romanian school and became a Romanian nationalistic, in the 1880s, before he died, he wrote a poem. His name was actually Eminescu, Mihail Eminescu, whose name is romanized into that. So in this poem, which is about 5 pages, he writes down how the Romanian will reunite, and he's taking stock of all the Romanian territories that were oppressed by some other foreign powers, and the refrain is also in Romanian, entrance de la Nistru la Tisza, from river Dniester to river Tisza. The Dniester was a river flowing in the very middle of Russia, but Tisza was in the very middle of Hungary. But it didn't really matter, because in their national identity, nations allow daydreaming. But when the Romanian foreign policy started to look for an ally, then 5 or 6 years before the First World War, that was the Balkan Wars in 1912 to 1913, you know, the Second Balkan War and the whole war process was started on August the 10th of it was closed on August the 10th, 1913. That was Leonel Constantin Brătianu told at that time that for Romania, Romania must become a major power of the Balkan, because this was the time that in 1913, at the end of the Second Balkan War, the southern part of the Sisak, Kaliakra and Burastor counties were taken away from the Bulgarian Tsardom, because Bulgaria's Tsar is one of those the Tsardoms or empires in Europe, and this actually highlighted, and it's still maintaining the antagonism between Romania and Bulgaria. And then in 1918, half a year before the end of the war, the Romanian army, taking advantage of the turmoil of the Russian turmoil, moves in his troops to Bessarabia. These were major military results, and in the meanwhile, in 1878-79, they received, by the recommendation of Count Andrássy, Dobrudzsa at the seaside. Let me just make one important sentence with regard to Dobrudzsa. There was a Ion Brătianu, who was a government commissioner, who was commissioned to Romanize Bessarabia. Actually, he was commissioned by his relative, the Prime Minister, Brătianu, that there were few Romanians there, so Bessarabia should be Romanized. All the schools, the Russians, Yeshiva, the Jewish schools, the Bulgarian schools, Lipovan schools, the Russian, Ruthenian schools were all closed. Turkey was mobilizing, and only 2 Turkish schools were left open. Why are these pieces of information important? These are important because here in Dobrudzsa, in 1879 to 1918-20, the Romanian national policy concept was established. You can close down schools, you can be arrogant, everything is possible that the major powers would allow. And this national policy will be applied in the major and big Romania, which is 296,000 square kilometers, which is the 8th largest country now, Romania. This is what's been applied. And then the Romanian government, with after the 1920 Trianon Treaty and the Gyula-Fehérvár agreement as well. I have got a couple of more minutes left, but it's very important to note how this let us annex Transylvania to Romania as soon as possible. How does that develop? Well, I told you already that in 1910 there were 2.9 million Romanians living in Transylvania. Nicolae Iorga, one of the most outstanding Romanian historian, he was also a prime minister, he says that there were at least 4 million. But this is an exaggeration. It doesn't really matter how many were there, but what was their idea? Well, here too, the educational system was the start of everything. So when the Greek Catholic Church was introduced by the Habsburgs in Hungary, one of the most important Greek Catholic Church was established in Balázsfalva in 1840s, when in Hungary there were already a lot of liberal movements which the reform age, this is how it's called. In the Balázsfalvi school, Bernúcium, I could say many other things, they start considering that the professors, Dongu professors, that something should be done with Transylvania. And then the revolution comes, the fight for freedom, the 50s, 60s in the Transylvanian Assembly, they have a majority right. But then at the compromise, 1866, 1869, if you look at the journal of the deputies, you can see that all the Romanians, the Romanian deputies who got their places in the Hungarian parliament are demanding autonomy for Transylvania, for at least 20 counties. The Deák Ferenc and Count Ötvös and Count Andrássy sweep it off the floor, so they say it's no way, but finally they are very delighted that they can establish the integrated Hungarian royal country, but the bill number 44 since 1868, it was written by Deák's very calligraphic letter, so he's the one who is wording and drafting the preamble. Historians say that this was a nice piece of act, but nothing was implemented out of that. But this is only partly true, because a lot of it was implemented. This was the single Hungarian law of this kind in a multinationality country like in France. They do not have it till to date, so the French could learn from Deák for sure. But let me just tell you one other example that is quite tells a lot. Romanians get a religious authority. We oppress, in inverted commas, the Romanians in the time of dualism, that they had 3 Greek Catholic archbishopric, 1 archbishop, and the Orthodox Romanian had 2 bishoprics with 2 bishops and 1 cardinals. And then when Tisza starts talking to a landlord in 1910 called Mihu, he said to him, well, please talk to the heads of the Romanian church, and this is what's happening. Well, in today's Romania, this could be inconceivable that the Romanian head of state would talk about the Transylvanian Hungarians' right to the bishops. I'm just telling you to bring you home that in the time of dualism, even if it's not the best, but among the the circumstances, then France was the most chauvinistic country of Europe. Then there the national minorities were fought against by weapons, but here in Hungary, Romanians are getting a lot of rights. Let me just tell you that Lancho Benedek, in his book about the Romanian irredentistic movements, it is the book was written in 1920, issued by the Carpathia Publishing. This is a rarity, and you can see also Bíró Sándor in minority and in a majority Romanian Hungarians since 1867 to 1920. 40. This was published by a Swiss publishing company. If you are interested, you can buy those books and please read them. So such an education system was given to them after 1867, not only at Balázsfalva, but there were also teachers training and colleges as well, where the language of Hungary, the state, was not even taught. Count Aponyi Albert, when in 1907-1908 submitted a bill of 3 laws and make it pass in the parliament. There was such an outcry in Bucharest complaining that they want to Romanize the 4 million Romanians living in Hungary because they had to learn Hungarian 2 lessons a week. Even Björnstjerne Børsen, a Norwegian writer, the author of the Norwegian hymn, was blaming it in the French press that Aponyi made a big big damage because of that. Let me go on. In 1848, 1849, Transylvanian Romanians made some massacres among the Transylvanian Hungarians. Let me just quote two names, Avram Iancu and Accente Sever. Sever means severe. And, you know, they committed mass murders. Unfortunately, and in 1867, they stayed in Hungary, and the Hungarian liberal government took mercy on them. There was no verdict given to them, and the Romanians, based on my own information, they thought that this is a sign of weakness, although it was just the self-destruction of the Hungarian liberals. And this process that got started at that time, for this, I think I have to share with you some figures, because the result was that in Transylvania, firstly Hungarian villages, secondly Saxon and Schwäbisch villages became mostly Romanized, hundreds of these, despite the fact that they were under Hungarian rule, Hungarian administrators, Hungarian education systems. Still, Sándor Bíró and also Benedek Jancsó write about this in their books, and I'm actually also writing it in my own books, quoting them. Between 1850 and 1900, and this process goes on until 1918, out of Hungarian villages, Romanized 309. So 309 Hungarian villages became villages of Romanian majority. Germans, 42 of them became Romanized, and near Temesvár there were 41 as well that became mostly Romanized. So that means 526 that became mostly Romanized. Of course, there were some other villages that became Hungarianized. 42 out of Romanians became Hungarians. So 13 became Germans, and from Serbians, 10 lost their Romanian majority, so this is 63. So if we deduct it, then that means that Romanians won over 284 villages. They thought that this was one of the main proofs and guarantees that, yes, Transylvania must join Romania. I'm running out of my time, but the situation is that I have to share with you one more blog for sure. This is the 10 years before Trianon, a long story in 3 minutes. So before the First World War, it became a habit that Romanian intelligentsia from Nagyszombat, Temesvár moved to Bucharest. They said that they have to flee because of the Hungarian regime to Bucharest. So they became the irredentic social organizations drivers. Let me just mention one organization like that, although there were a lot. I mentioned to you already the name of Nicolae Iorda. In the 10 to 12 years before the First World War, he was the Secretary General of the Liga Culturale. It's a cultural league of Romanians living all around the world. Well, this was the organization that was carrying on the propaganda for the Romanian Transylvania. I'm actually writing about this in one of my books, that they made such a huge propaganda. They mentioned that in France, that the Hungarians do not observe the liberté, fraternité, égalité slogans, but we Romanians are relatives to you, France. In Italy, this was an easy propaganda because Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was Freemasonry's Grand Master, his son, Menotti Garibaldi, started to be a friend of Romanians, and he was hating Hungarians very much. In Italy, the Romanian irredentic forces said that, yes, Italians, Romanians are relatives. We are just the Daco Romanians, but we are still relatives. In Germany and in Austria, they had had the propaganda in a very cunning way, just to serve their own interests, that look at the Hungarians. 1703, Rákóczi, the Kossuth Hunde. Kossuth Hund is the Erzrebel revolting dog. The Hungarians were always revolting against you Germans, and at the very end, Björnsen Björnsson, I already quoted the Norwegian writer, so a very strange situation developed in Hungary when the war broke out. Then a lot of people thought that if the Entente would win, then the monarchy, not only the monarchy, but also all the other countries will have to be sliced up. And when the 1916 declaration of war from Romania took place, it was quite an interesting thing that happened. The declaration of war were 3 or 4 lines that was sent by the imperial court to Serbia. The Romanian declaration of war is about 2.5 pages on a printed page. So this is a historical study, as if that was published at the currently working Romanian Academy of Sciences, or issued at the Babes-Bolyai University. And that would be the closing part of my short speech. Well, it says that in 1883 the Romanian government made a military agreement with the Austrian-Hungarian government, which was signed by the emperors, by the empire as well, because they thought that this will protect the Romanians in Transylvania. But those hopes that we had established because of anticipating that we will belong to these 3 major powers, it was in vain. But during this period that was lasting over 30 years, the Romanians never could see that such a major reform could have been implemented, which could have at least give a kind of seemingly could give a kind of compensation for them, but instead they were treated as a species of subordinated nature, and which were destined therefore to be oppressed by injustice of an alien power which is in minority. And because of all these damages and hurting deeds, Romania declares a war against the empire, and this alien element is Hungary, because the current leaders of Romania also consider Hungary as an alien element. Ladies and gentlemen, in a small presentation like that, it's very difficult to tell the very interesting plethora of Hungarian Romanian history. But let me add that history is not stopping, it is operating, and if Hungarians and Germans, Serbians, Jews and the Roma are oppressed for 100 years, Jews are actually very, very fiercely oppressed by the Romanians, then history asks the questions, how to carry on with Romania. Thank you so much.